Obandis. She had been documenting abandoned settlements for many years. She expected silence from the mountain village. She found almost silence. On the second day, the voices began. Suggestions of conversation from empty buildings, laughter from a collapsed roof, children running along the village path where none exist. She recorded everything until she played it back and understood that what she had recorded was not background noise. It was responding to her. Don't play back any recordings made in empty places tonight. It is time for chapter 172. Abandoned places hold something of the life that occupied them, not dramatically, simply the particular quality of a space that was once full of daily human activity and is now without it. Most researchers who work in such spaces learn to read this quality without being troubled by it. The settling of old wood, the particular acoustics of empty rooms, the way wind moves through spaces designed for occupation. Most sounds in abandoned places have explanations rooted in the physical properties of old structures. But occasionally something responds, not from the structure, from whatever the structure still holds, of the life that was there and is not entirely gone. A historian had spent many years documenting abandoned rural settlements, photographing, recording ambient sound, cataloging what remained of the physical structures. The mountain village had been on her research list for some time, empty for 60 years following the departure of its last residents. The reasons for the abandonment documented in regional records she had already studied. She arrived in early autumn. The village was as she had expected, overgrown paths between wooden buildings in various states of decay, the particular stillness of somewhere that had been without daily human activity for 6 decades. She set up her equipment, began her documentation. The first day passed without incident. On the second day, the voices began. They were not clear. Simply the suggestion of voices, the particular frequency of human conversation heard from a distance or through walls. She had encountered similar sounds in other abandoned settlements and had learned to distinguish them from wind and settling timber. These were different, not dramatically, simply subtly wrong in the way of sounds that have the quality of deliberate communication rather than structural noise. She noted them in her log, continued her work. The laughter came from the building with the partially collapsed roof. Brief, specific, the laughter of someone amused by something. The child's footsteps on the path behind her were clear enough that she turned to look. The path was empty. She turned back to her work and raised her recording levels. Izui, that adjustment. Uncomfortable in the specific way of someone who knows they are documenting something they have not yet categorized. If these stories have found their way to you, if you find yourself returning to this quiet room, there is something small you can do. Like and subscribe. It tells me, and whatever else watches from this room, that you were here and that you intend to find your way back. If you have a story of your own, Granny is always listening, watching, waiting. She worked through the second day and into the early evening, documenting systematically. The voices continued, intermittently, never clearly enough to be understood as words, always with the quality of conversation happening just beyond the threshold of comprehension. She recorded continuously. At the end of the day, she returned to her temporary accommodation outside the village and reviewed what she had captured. The ambient recordings were clear. The structural sounds she had expected were present, and beneath them, consistent across the day's recording, the voices. She isolated them from the other sound, listened carefully with her equipment, and understood that what she had recorded was not ambient. The voices were not simply present, they were responding to her movements through the village, to her questions spoken aloud, which she habitually asked of empty spaces as part of her documentation method. The answers were there in the recordings. Quiet, consistent, responding, shakoi, the headphones against her ears, cold in the way of understanding that she had been in conversation all day without knowing it. I wonder if you played back a recording made in an empty place and heard responses to things you had said aloud, would you go back the following day? If you have a story of your own, this quiet room has space for your experiences too. Granny is always listening. She went back the following day. This time she listened as she worked rather than simply recording, adjusted her equipment to amplify the frequency range the voices occupied, asked her documentation questions with deliberate care, and heard, faintly, at the edge of what the equipment could resolve, responses. Not always, not to every question, but consistently enough across the morning that by midday she had stopped pretending the pattern was coincidence. The village was not empty in the way abandoned places are usually empty. Something remained in it, something that had learned apparently to respond to the questions of whoever came to document what was left. She spent the afternoon simply talking to the village, asking what she genuinely wanted to know, listening carefully to what came back. You are still here. Good. Some stories need a witness all the way to the end. I wonder if you discovered that an empty place was responding to you, what would you most want to ask it? She told me she asked everything she had always wanted to ask of the places she documented. Why did they leave? What they missed? Whether anything remained of what the village had been. The responses, she was careful to describe them precisely, were not clear answers, simply the quality of being heard, of presence registering presence, of something in the village acknowledging that she was there and that her questions were received. She completed her documentation, filed her research, and in the notes accompanying her recordings, she wrote simply that the acoustic properties of this particular settlement were unusual and merited further study. She did not describe the responses in her official documentation, said the language available to her professionally was insufficient for what she had experienced, and that what had happened in that village belonged in the category of things better understood slowly, over time, by someone sitting quietly beside a kotatsu, willing to listen carefully to what comes back. That's right. Exactly right. I think about abandoned places and what they hold. The assumption of emptiness is a convenient one. It allows us to move through spaces that were once full of life without being troubled by what that life left behind. But the historian who raises her recording levels because something is subtly wrong with the sound she is hearing, who listens back to a day's recording and isolates voices responding to her questions, has moved past the convenience of the assumption into the less comfortable territory of what abandoned actually means, which is not empty, simply no longer occupied in the way we usually mean occupation, still present, still capable of response, still apparently willing to answer the questions of someone patient enough to ask them and careful enough to listen. I have been listening to abandoned places for a very long time. They have considerably more to say than their silence suggests. Another whispered story from Japan, shared quietly here beside the kotatsu. If you work in abandoned places, documenting, researching, simply exploring, record everything. And at the end of the day, when you review what you have captured, isolate the frequencies beneath the structural noise, listen carefully to what occupies that range. Because occasionally what you recorded is not ambient sound, not settling timber or wind through empty rooms, something that has remained in the space after the people left. That has learned across 60 years of researchers and explorers moving through it to respond to the questions spoken aloud by whoever comes to document what was there. Ask what you genuinely want to know. Listen carefully to what comes back, and write in your notes that the acoustic properties of this settlement are unusual and merit further study. Because what you experienced belongs in the category of things understood slowly, by someone willing to sit quietly with what the abandoned place has been waiting, apparently, to tell someone. If this story stayed with you, if the dark or the shadow feels a little closer tonight, you know where to find me. I am always here beside the kotatsu, watching, waiting. And if you wish others to find their way here too, there is something small you can do. Like and subscribe. I would not object. And if you have a story of your own, this quiet room has space for your experiences too. Granny is always listening.